Welcome to When I Stop Fighting the podcast. My name is Daryl Dittmer, and today I'm joined by Nadine Mulvina, creator of The Sober Butterfly and host of the Sober Butterfly podcast, and a sober human. Thank you so much for joining us. We have so happy to have you on, Nadine.
Daryl, it is my absolute pleasure. Thank you for thinking of me. I'm so happy and honored to be a part of this experience, and you just have such a light and so much wisdom. Thanks for coming on my show. I'm so excited to get into whatever we're going to talk about today. So, thank you.
Uh, oh, thank you. That's so nice of you to say. I really appreciate that, and I very much enjoyed being on your show. That was really cool, really fun. And we talked about some great things and just I'm constantly reminded, right, that life is just not as complicated and ridiculous as we try to make it sometimes, and the ease of our ability to just talk about stuff was wonderful. So I'm sure we'll experience that today.
I agree. Can't wait.
So I just find everybody's individual journey so interesting and so wonderful to hear, especially as people get sober and start to experience sobriety and recovery and a better life. So could we start with your journey that led you to sobriety?
Absolutely. I love to talk about it. So, I have been sober for almost 3 years and I have not taken a single day for granted. I so just for listeners at home, my sobriety date is July 5th, 2001. So right after 4th of July. But I would say my fight, especially in lieu of this podcast, my fight with getting sober was years and years in the making. I first tried my sip of alcohol, my first taste of alcohol at the age of 13. And I always looked older. I probably look like this. I'm 33 now, but I probably look like this since the age of 13. I'm not joking. So I always looked
Mm,
older and presented myself as being a lot more mature than I actually was. And I think a part of that is growing up as an only child with a lot of female relatives. Like I was always like in the mix of conversations and giving advice. I just always had more wisdom or thought I had more wisdom than my age actually portrayed. And so at 13, you could not tell me that I was a 13-year-old in seventh grade. Like I behaved as
mm,
though I was probably like a 20-year-old. And so that kind of naturally lent itself to me hanging out with an older cousin of mine. She's actually been on the podcast and has kind of verified some of the stories that I think as I experienced them believed that it was normal, but hearing them from a grown perspective, from an adult perspective, I was just like, whoa, 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 that's not normal. So it humanized the experience for me. But long story short, I first tried alcohol at 13, and it was with her, this older cousin. She was 5 years older than me, so she was a freshman in college. And my family thought it was okay to like let me have a college experience. I was just going up for the weekend. She went to the University of South Florida in Tampa, and I at this time was living in South Florida. So I went up for the weekend, and I experienced my first college party at 13. I got completely blackout drunk. I passed out. I threw up the next day. So I had my first sip of alcohol, my first drunk, my first hangover, my first blackout, just all in one big culmination. And my cousin, it's interesting because she was explaining to me her perspective. Although she was older, she was still kind of a kid herself. She was like 18 at the time. And she was like, I did not take my eyes off of you. Like you were safe. So it was almost like this, like, contradiction where it's like, oh, I'm in a controlled, safe environment, but at the same time,
mm.
this is not safe. Like, this is the blind leading the blind. Like, why am, as a 13-year-old at a college party, getting completely sloshed? So that was my first time trying alcohol. And I remember, Daryl, from that very first experience, I knew, even in my 13-year-old brain, that this was going to be a problem for me. I didn't know the
Mm.
extent. I didn't know how it would unfold, but I just knew that I loved it way too much. Even the hangover act, it was almost like what do you call it? Like uh like this badge of honor. That's how it felt. Like it was a badge
Mm.
of honor to have my first hangover. And then I also learned in that experience, Daryl, how to hide it. Like the sickness lives in secrecy. Like I
Mm,
knew that obviously my family would not be okay with me going to a college party at 13 and getting completely wasted. So when I went home after that weekend, I pretended that everything was fine, and it was just a very vanilla experience. Like, oh, went this, we went here, we went there, but I of course did not disclose the full activities of that weekend. So I learned a couple things. I learned how to hide my drinking. I learned that I could function, because even though I had a hangover and felt terrible, I was still going about with the workings of that particular itinerary for that weekend. And it just lent itself to me, like I said, having years and years of abuse through alcohol. So that was like 13, obviously. And funny enough, I went to high school. I wasn't a huge drinker in high school. I went to high school parties, and anytime I did drink, my preference was to drink in excess. Like I would go periods where I wouldn't drink, but then if I was at a party and alcohol was present, I was completely wasted, that kind of thing.
mm,
And then I think where my alcoholism really presented itself full force was in college. So I think there's this culture that exists amongst college students to rage and, you know, to go to the tailgates and have these crazy keg parties and do all the wild things, and it's very much normalized. But even in college, I recognized that my drinking, even though it was socially acceptable to be completely drunk for the majority of the time at any like social event, I always took it to the next level. Like I always had to outdo myself. My previous drunk, I was the girl that always had stories, and I was the girl that in the group chats, it was always like Nadine was just so wild and crazy last night, and let's talk about that, and blacking out and just having this party girl persona and really owning that and living in that as my truth. And once again, almost like a badge of honor, really embracing that. And so I thought it was okay, even though I knew, I think my intuition, I would say, knew that this once again was not okay. So I kept drinking in college and kept hiding my drinking from people that cared about me, like my family, because I knew addiction ran pretty rampant within my own family, and I didn't want
mm,
to mirror some of the tendencies that other loved ones had as well. So I wasn't really like showcasing the extent of my drinking. I was also masking it by telling myself, well, the way in which my loved ones, my family members drank was very different from how I was drinking. I was drinking socially, so I'm different somehow, right? But not recognizing that the progressive nature of alcohol, it doesn't work like that. You don't wake up one day and you're immediately an alcoholic. It takes years to sometimes fully form. And so I was very much on that trajectory. And I think I didn't want to admit that to myself, but somehow knew all along that it wasn't going to end well for myself. So graduated college, cum laude, still was able to keep my grades up, and I was partying. That was my full major basically, but I actually didn't major in partying. I majored in English, but like I just had this duality that coexisted. I was able to hide a lot of my drinking, is what I'm trying to say, from loved ones at home, as well as like my colleagues. When I say colleagues, like my professors, people that I respected. Like they never would have thought that outside of the classroom I was the main party girl, that kind of thing. And I think just one other like thing I want to touch on, where my drinking shifted in college from this is fun, even in moments where it was extremely dangerous, to um, this is a coping mechanism. Was my father unexpectedly passed away my
mm,
sophomore year of college, and that really took a toll on my mental health. And I turned to alcohol in a different way. So before, like I mentioned, I was very social. I was the party girl. And then this is when I started to drink at home, in isolation. I saw a different side of myself come to life, which was anger. I just had this deep seated hatred and resentment towards God, towards just why me, very much wallowing
mm.
in self pity and not understanding why my father had to die unexpectedly. So yeah, it was so that was a new thing for me at that time. And so after college, I moved to New York, and I lived a very fast New York City girl lifestyle. I had a 9 to 5. I was a teacher and I was excelling in that role. But in my free time, I was drinking just as much as I was drinking in college, if not more, actually. I was introduced to wine. I think we tried to humanize our drinking. We're not even humanize it. We try to make it sound more sophisticated. Maybe that's a better way to frame it. So, now I'm a mid-20s girly and I'm like, oh, like I'm not going to be taking shots of tequila anymore. I'm going to just drink 2 bottles of wine a night. And so that was a way for me to keep justifying my drinking. And then I'll just kind of speed up here. I really came to heads with the extent of my drinking in COVID, as many people, I think their drinking was exasperated or their using was exasperated during that time. I was living in Mexico City by myself. I was working remotely, and I had escaped Tulum, which is a different part of Mexico, because you know how they say, oh, like maybe it's the environment. This is what I was telling myself. Maybe it's the environment of being in Tulum, which is very much like jungle vibes. At the time, Mexico had just opened its borders. So it was attracting all of these different types of people from the world. And so party people, myself included, flocked to Tulum. And I was just in an environment where everyone was drinking, everyone was using drugs. You would go to a restaurant go to the bathroom in the restaurant and outside positioned like a soldier was somebody from the cartel asking you like coke, molly, weed. So you just had all of these
Mm,
things at your disposal, and I was like a kid in a candy store. I just went for it. And so after like 3 to 4 weeks of partying every single day and drinking every single day and using every single day, I was just sitting on the beach one day and I looked up at the stars and I had almost like my come to Jesus moment where I just realized that I could die. Like I was just in a cocktail of different things and I was just like, I have to leave. And so the funny thing is, Daryl, is you can outrun a place, but you can't outrun yourself. So then I moved to Mexico
mm,
City on a whim, literally left Tulum 24 hours after that moment on the beach looking at the stars and talking to God. And I went to Mexico City, but then I found myself in a similar predicament where I was going out, I had made new friends, I lived there for a year, and I was just consistently partying, drinking at home, mixing with different substances like pills, party drugs, things like that. And I just realized, yeah, it's not Tulum, it's not Mexico City, it's me. And so I put myself in therapy, and through therapy, I was confronted with the question by my therapist, which kudos to who, because it was very low touch. I think if anyone had tried to like have a full on intervention, I would not have been accepting. But she just kept asking me week after week, well, how would you define your relationship with alcohol? Because every single story I told her on a weekly basis, something would happen, and the common denominator, you probably guessed it, was alcohol. And so after so many weeks of, her asking me this question, I finally realized that I could not control my drinking and it was ruining my life. Yeah, so I'll stop there. That's sort of like a little bit of my history.
well, thank you so much for sharing that. And I do want to say I'm so sorry to hear that that happened with your dad and you being at such a young age. That's just got to be really difficult. My mom lost her dad when she was 19, and I know that that was just a tough, tough, tough thing. So I'm sorry to hear that.
Thank you, Daryl. Thank
Um,
you.
sure. The you know that it's so funny, and you brought it up. There was one thing that you mentioned that was hiding from other people, and I think that is such a for me, that was one of my biggest fights. That was one of my biggest fights with myself because I was hiding from other people. But then you mentioned a little bit later, we're hiding from ourselves, and that's one thing that just can't happen. We can't hide from ourselves. We can BS other people until the cows come home, and
Mm,
maybe they believe us and maybe they don't, but we can't get past ourselves. And I think that was just such a great sort of spotlight for you to see Nadine, right?
right.
And I mean that's really powerful that you understood that I would say a relatively young age. I mean, to look at that and understand that at a relatively young age is really, really impressive. So very happy for you.
I appreciate it. And it's like the recognition, like realizing that this lives inside of me, which I would say the alcoholism I knew from the first time I tried alcohol lived inside of me. Like I recognized it, but I wasn't willing to accept it just yet. So it was like I could see it, I could identify it, but it took years. It literally from 13 to 30. I got sober at 30 years old. That's a long time. So yeah, but you're right. Like being able to identify is the first step almost. Like if you don't admit that you can see something is wrong or you recognize that something is wrong, then you're never going to get help. You're never going to change.
So true. And so, and I guess my opinion is, okay, I've let go of the alcohol or drugs or whatever it is, all that sort of stuff that we hide ourselves from. And so what happens after that? What's next for you, or what was next for you on that journey?
Yeah, so as mentioned, therapy was the first time I was fully confronted with this notion by a professional because at various points in my life, I think certain people had tried to allude to the fact that they thought I had a problem. And when I say even allude, directly told me, like, I think you have a drinking problem. And I'm just like, I think I don't care about your opinion. So that kind of thing. But the therapist is someone that, I was paying and I trusted her. And, like I mentioned, she had more of a low touch approach, which is, I think, the perfect delivery that I needed at that time. So I was forced to recognize through self awareness, though, it wasn't her diagnosing me and saying you're an alcoholic. It was more so just like this question. And so I really had to think about it. Okay, like how do I define my relationship with alcohol? I knew it was problematic, but to what extent was it problematic? And I recognized, or when I started to recognize that all of these issues or problems that I had in my life were always in some semblance connected to my drinking, I was like, okay, let me try and change this. But I didn't know, to get to your question, I didn't know what was next. I didn't know how to change it. I just knew that I wanted different for myself.
Mm.
And I was on this, path of insanity, which is trying the same thing and expecting different results. So I actually started in that conversation with my therapist once I came to that realization that alcohol was a culprit. I was like, let me try, like so many of us, we tell ourselves, let's try to moderate. Let's see how that works. So it was almost like a social experiment. I tried to moderate and I was miserable. I was miserable. I can be a little bit of a perfectionist. So when I really set my mind to something, I want to do it full diligence. I want to be the best at it. And it was really, really tough for me to do it. And even in those moments when I white knuckled my way through moderation, and I'm sure you've heard this, Daryl, like the mental gymnastics of trying to freaking calculate how many drinks you can withhold yourself from because it's all restraint, right? Like I want
Mm.
everything. I don't want to have two drinks, but because I'm such a perfectionist, I'm like I can prove to myself that I'm not an alcoholic, right? Like I can have two drinks and be fine. So a couple of times I would be able to, or not a couple of times, more than twice. Like I tried to moderate just for timeline purposes for a good like 6 weeks, right? And I was like, oh, like I can do this. I reported back to her, and I wanted to show her I was a good patient. And so I would have these moments of being able to moderate, but the whole time I was just suffering. I hated it. And I wasn't disclosing that part to her. I was just like, yeah, last night I went out and I only had two drinks, like I said I would, right? Right? Give me the gold star. And then there were also moments when I failed and I would have to, tail between my legs, also report that to my therapist. And I think the final straw was I went out, like it's almost like imagine being on a diet and you're doing okay, you're doing what you're supposed to be doing. You cut the carbs, you cut the sugar, and then one day you wake up and you have the worst craving ever and you just go for it. You just binge and you just go for everything. That's basically what I had. That's the best way I
Mm.
can describe it. Like I was just sick of being on a diet. I was sick of moderating and I went all in on a cocktail of different things and I ended up having a moment where I basically I guess you would call it a bender. I partied for like almost 48 hours, to the point where I went out with friends. It started off on an innocuous night, a very innocent night, like, oh, I'm gonna go to a club with a few friends, and I pre-gamed, and then of course at the club, not of course, I don't know if this is everyone's experience. My experience, it seems like, oh, of course, I go to the club and there's people that I know there, and they have sections, and everyone's just doing drugs. I don't even know what drugs they're doing. I'm just gonna take it because you're offering it to me. Like it was just like a blue powder, I remember, and I was doing that, and next thing you know, I'm at someone's house for an after party, and the after party rolls into the next day, and I just remember my same friends I'd seen at the club go to the after party, which is like 24 hours later, and I'm still dressed in the same outfit because I haven't gone home. I haven't stopped partying. And I had a friend that called me who was concerned about me because he was like, "Why are you still out? Like, have you gone home?" And it was just like, basically, that was like I would describe that as like the closest thing to a rock bottom for me. Um, there were other things I'm glossing over, like I hooked up with someone that I had no business hooking up with. It was just like I was out. It was an out of body experience, and I almost remember like seeing myself go through the motions and just saying, why are you still here? Why are you doing this? Why are you putting yourself through this? But I couldn't stop. I just literally couldn't stop. I didn't want to. And so that was, like I said, me moderating. That was supposed to be me moderating. And then I just had this full on bender. And so when I reported that back to my therapist, we came up with a game plan. And I was going to, because at the time, actually, I was still in Mexico. And this is actually what prompted me to leave Mexico altogether, that experience. But I was going to try to completely get sober after that. Like she was just like, this is why don't you take a break? Like why don't you just instead of moderating, go cold turkey? And so I did that, and it was it wasn't successful the first time. I've had many first days. This was around summertime. I think the transition of moving back to the States after being away for a year was challenging. They say people, places, things. I was back in my old environment when I moved back to New York. I'm going to the same places. I'm seeing the same people. I'm in familiar turf, and that turf is very murky for me. And so I tried to get sober, and I almost was successful. And this is leading up to my actual soberisary day, the one that stuck. So I did a few weeks of like completely being sober, like not doing anything, and then had another collision, I'll call it, where I love people to hear people's sobriety dates because usually there's something that happens right before then. So for me, it was Fourth of July weekend, and I had pre-booked a trip with a friend to, of all places. We thought it was a great idea to go to the Jersey Shore, to go to Atlantic City. Yeah, that was smart. And so yeah, I just had this crazy another bender. It's like I think at that time I had like 3 or so weeks of sobriety under my belt, and I was feeling pretty proud about that. But then the friend that I went to the shore with, or to Atlantic City with, she's drinking wine in the car on the way there. I'm driving, and as soon as I got there, like if anyone's never been to Atlantic City, it's literally like you're walking through a time capsule. Like it was just like hello 1980s and hello cocaine and hello, like it was just a whirlwind of a weekend. And that was the time, though, I remember feeling like I couldn't even get drunk or high. I was doing everything. I was drinking in copious amounts and taking lots of drugs, and I couldn't feel the way I wanted to feel, which I don't even know what I was
Mm.
trying to feel, Daryl. I just wanted to feel something, and I couldn't even get there. And I remember the next day I had the worst hangover. So it was just like this, like my body was rejecting. It was just like shutting down. It was just like, we don't want this anymore. And I was so ashamed of myself because I went through this short period of sobriety. And I don't know. I don't know what it was. I just decided that I wanted something different for myself. And there's a saying which is interesting because I've always heard the opposite of addiction is connection, which I 100% agree with. However, what I needed at that time, I think, like I mentioned, being back in my old stomping grounds, being surrounded by people who I used to use with and party with and do all the things with, there's another expression that resonated with me at that time, which was isolation for preparation. I had to isolate myself. And that is connected to people, places, things, right? Like removing those toxic, not even always toxic, but just familiar things that can
Mm,
trigger you. And so I isolated myself, and then I ended up going on this 5 week trip with two girlfriends who were not sober, like, but they also really supported my sobriety. They didn't drink, they didn't do any drugs in front of me. Like, they really supported me, which I'd never experienced that before because most of my friends were like me. So it was just like a really refreshing moment to be outside of my comfort zone so I could grow and also supported with people that understood and respected what I was trying to do as opposed to trying to sabotage me because I've also experienced that. So I guess I just realized that I was ready to answer your question. I don't know what made me more ready this time than in previous times, but I was tired. I think that's another part of it. I was
mm.
just kind of tired of doing the same thing, hoping for a change, trying to change myself instead of like recognizing, going back to what we talked about before, this is who I am. I'm an addict. And instead of being ashamed of that, saying, okay, well, what do you need? What do you need to live a fulfilling life? And instead of trying to maybe be like everyone else, embracing who I am so I can actually thrive in this current vessel, in my current, just it was just a realization that maybe I'm not like everyone else, and that's okay.
Yeah, that's so insightful, and thank you for sharing more of that story, Nadine, because there's all I have to do, and I've been sober for a long time, and I look at my life, and I'm like, and I can be, extreme, and I can be, I can just, like you talked about, if you're on a diet and then one day you're just off, and it's like four
Hmm.
gallons of Haagen-Dazs and six pizzas and whatever else, right? Like I'm
Yep.
capable of that. I'm very capable of that, and I know I'm capable of that. If somebody gives me something to do, or I decide, I'm going to do something like write a book, I'll probably write two, or I'm going to do podcasts, I'll do like 16 a day. So I have to understand, right? I have to understand myself, and that it sounds like you had some wonderful moments of clarity on that journey, and continue to, and it's a wonderful thing. Like I don't mind being a maniac. I don't, because I can temper it. I
Right.
can temper it now, and I can calm myself, and I do the things, and I have the habits that help me do that. So what would you say, I guess, at this point in your sobriety, and you are a light. I
Thank
love
you.
your you're a wonderful sober person because you appreciate it and you embrace it, and I can feel that, and that's a really cool thing, because some people don't enjoy being sober,
Yeah.
and that's tough. It's tough to see that some people don't enjoy being sober, and not that people need to be, enjoy life all the time, because sometimes things are tough and sometimes things suck, and that's okay. That's part of the journey, right? So what would you say is your greatest ally? Who or what would be your greatest ally now in your sobriety?
Yeah, I love that question. And I want to touch on the ally part, but something you mentioned about people like not necessarily liking their experience or the process of being sober, like you're 100% right. And I think that's why I've devoted so much of my time and energy into creating the platform, The Sober Butterfly, because I want to showcase the beauty of sobriety. And it's not to gloss over the
Mm,
difficult parts. Like, I recognize it can be really hard, and everyone has a different, journey to sobriety. Like, I had a difficult time, but like I know there are levels. So I understand that like you may not love every aspect of sobriety, and especially in the beginning. Like, I didn't really have so much of a pink cloud effect. Like, it sucked. It sucked so badly. And I remember those moments, and I lean into that discomfort now because obviously I've gotten to a place where I'm like, oh yeah, like this is amazing because I see the benefit, I see the progress, I see the growth. But when you're going through it, oh my God, you're going through it. I think this hopefully is helpful for other people because it was really helpful for me, is it's almost like you have to reframe. And it's not reframing the way you see it is a big part of it, the culture we live in, right? Like if all the messaging is around like you need alcohol, you need substances to have a good time, like that can be extra difficult. But that's why I think a big part of me learning to lean into the sober life more was the beauty of social media, right? Finding people that I could connect with, even if it was like we're not friends in real life. As mentioned, I didn't really know any sober people. I think I mentioned that before. So I had to like
Mhm.
get a lot of inspiration to draw from on my own. And a big part of that was looking on social media, finding accounts that I resonated with, seeing influencers or people or podcasters or authors or people who were actually sober, who had that sober time that could look back and also share some gems so that I could see like, oh my God, I want what they have. Like they seem like they're happy. And it's not BS.
Mhm.
I literally have lifted myself out of the pits of despair because of my sobriety. And to now lead to your question about what resources or who have I turned to that's helped me. A big part of it is, I'm not going to lie, like it comes from within. It's a connection to my higher power. I didn't used to believe in a higher power in the traditional sense because I was so angry. This is like stemming back to being 19 when I lost my father. Like that anger that I touched on, it was towards God. I was so pissed. I
Mhm.
was so just like I grew up in the church and it was my opportunity to rebel. I was just like, I'm done with this. Like, I don't want any part of this. Like, what kind of God could let this happen? And so it took healing. It took not just healing myself and parts of myself and my inner child work, it took healing my relationship with God. And if God scares people, like, fine, but you have to recognize that there is something greater that doesn't, in my opinion, this is obviously my opinion, there's something greater than me, right? And that's the
Mhm.
beauty, going back to that saying, the opposite of addiction is connection. You have to feel connected to something. And for me, that something was my higher power. It was finding people who believed in me as much as I believed in myself, because I also struggled with that. Like I struggled with relationships in getting sober. I felt like so many people counted me out. So many of my friends didn't think that I was serious about my sobriety because of the persona that I lived up to for so long and I created for myself. I had to find connection with people who were sober, whether, like I said, that was in real life or on social media. I just had to find people who inspired me, and then I created the Sober Butterfly as a means to inspire other people. That wasn't actually in the intention. It was initially in the beginning me holding myself accountable. This is not for
Mhm.
everyone, but this is what helped me. I'm a very like visual person, and so I'm just like, okay, if I'm gonna say I'm gonna be sober, like I said, I can be a perfectionist. I can be a bit of a. I'm gonna be honest. Like I when people count me out, I'm like, how can I prove you wrong? That kind of thing. So I had people who were not in my corner supporting my sobriety. So I felt like I was going to prove to them, which may not be the best for everyone, but for myself, this is what I did realistically. I felt like I had to prove to myself and prove to other people that I could do this. And it was messy, but it was definitely something that kept me going every day. And it gave me like a little sense of like purpose. And then it started to turn into people, you know, connecting with me. I also have 30 days sober. Amazing. I
Mhm.
also, want to take a trip because I was traveling at this time. I also want to take a trip. How are you navigating sober travel? So just finding people who also were living through some of the things that I was going through at that time was extremely helpful. But what I turn to now, I think, because I'm coming up to 3 years of sobriety, and like, how did I get to this place? Like I didn't have a game plan. Like I knew I had a problem with alcohol. I knew I needed to take a break. I didn't necessarily think it would be forever. And when people would ask me, are you going to be sober forever? In the beginning, almost like a defense mechanism, I would say no. Oh no, I'm just like taking a break. Like I didn't want to admit that I was an alcoholic or I had a problem. It was just like I need to take a break. And I felt like that seemed more palpable, that was like more digestible for other people as well
Mhm.
to understand. Until I started to really see the growth and see the beauty of sobriety, to where I was like, why would I even consider going back to that place? of who I was or where I was before. Like it just doesn't make sense. Like why would I backtrack? And so a big part of it has been connection, has been community, has been, doing the work on myself, but also being of service to other people and just living in truth every single day. That's the hardest part. I think the getting sober piece for me was due to honesty and finally having that honest conversation with myself. And then staying sober is a big part of that too. It's like consistently checking in with yourself and saying, okay, like what's working? It's not going to be perfect every single day in sobriety. That's a fallacy. If anyone tells you that, they're lying to you. But it is, and I hate to be, full of cliches, not cliches or sayings, but like it is true that my worst day in sobriety is better than my worst day in addiction. My best day, I'm sorry, in addiction because those highs weren't real. Like that's what I've come to realize. Like I wasn't really floating or as high as I thought it was in terms of my energy or my like emotions. I was simply trying to numb something out or not deal with something else. Like it was there was always something else going on that wasn't coming to the surface because I was suppressing it because I wanted to chase something else. And going back to my sobriversary date, July 4th, I couldn't I couldn't get to that high anymore. So it was like I was still dealing with the things I was trying to run away from. And I'm so
Mm.
grateful for that, Daryl, because had it not been for that, had I maybe been able to get high that day or drunk that day, I probably would have kept masking. I probably would have kept trying to cope with substances. But because I couldn't, it was just like, well, why am I doing this? Like, what is the point of this even?
100%. Yeah, your ability to be honest with yourself is just really cool because that's what it takes. I mean, there's a lot of nasty stuff, and we all have our stories, and I think the most interesting thing to me is everybody's got their story, which they're all a little bit different, but we all come together on the on the playing field of emotion, right? We
Right.
all feel the same stuff, and that despair and that just unhappiness, and those are the things that drive us to get away from this nasty thing called alcohol and drugs. But I love the story. I do. I guess I love the honesty. I think that is the thing that really hits me because that's what it takes, and I know that's what it takes, and I've known hundreds, if not thousands, of people who either have wanted to be sober or maybe 97% wanted to be sober, and until
Hmm.
you're 100% and you're honest, it ain't going to happen.
Right.
Like that's just how it goes. So if you were going to talk to a newly sober person or somebody who's, let's just say they've set it down for a week and what do I do now? What advice would you give to that person uh, to help them along?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I feel like, as mentioned, I'm a very visual person. I also have had years of experience in the education, so very data driven is the point I'm trying to make. So I would say like treat it like a social experiment, especially because that feels a bit more palatable, right? Like I don't need to do this forever because I think that can be daunting for many people to say
Mm,
forever, like I can't ever do this thing or have this thing again. Like that can scare people literally to the point of not wanting to even try. So I would say like how do you feel? And then, but to answer that question, how you feel, there's two answers, right? There's two types of answers. One's quantitative and one's qualitative. Give me the quantitative data. At what point? Because so many times we're like, I feel like this, right? And it's an emotion that can be qualitative, but tracking when you feel like this, when you feel depressed, when you feel like you really have a craving, you need something, that can also reveal something else to you. Like, are your cravings triggered by a biological response, right? You had a cup of coffee and now, for example, you want to have a cigarette. Like cigarettes are not drugs, but you know what I mean. Like it's still like a
mm,
substance that many people are addicted to. Versus, oh, somebody said something. My partner said something really hurtful to me, and it made me want to have a drink, or it made me want to smoke a joint, or it made me want to do something like that. So like figuring out what's driving some of your your needs, your biological needs too, because there's science behind it, like, is really helpful, I believe. And it also
Mhm.
gives people a little bit more to base their decisions off of. Like, so you can refer back to this. So I would say keep a journal, or even on your notes phone, not notes phone, your notes app on your phone, just keep a quick tally of what's kind of like coming up for you and when it's coming up. And then you can decide later at the end of the week, if you're treating it like a social experiment, what some of those driving factors are. I think it's important to do that because it's easy to gloss over the progress, or gloss over like the suffering even, when you don't have something in black and white that you can refer back to. And I would also encourage people to get into therapy. It's almost like, because I think so many people, you know, are drinking, as mentioned, for reasons related to emotions, whether it's an emotional response or they're suffering with mental health, depression, anxiety, so on and so forth. I would not have, I think, had so much self awareness, or I don't think I would have gotten sober as quickly or possibly at all had I not been in therapy. So, for example, like if you are being given, say, like an antidepressant, that only addresses part of the problem. I think there's always going to be a need for therapy or some healing in connection to the medicine. So if sobriety is you removing substances for X amount of time, you determine what that looks like for you, because I think it looks different for different people. However, I believe that you need to also have some kind of connection to a mental health provider, or check in with someone to see what was driving some of those behaviors. And that's why keeping the data points, keeping the journal, keeping the running list on your phone, that can be something that you can share with a professional, or someone that you feel really comfortable with, so that you can make an informed decision moving forward. So I think it looks different, to answer your question long windedly, Daryl, for different people. The advice, though, I would give someone who is newly sober or thinking about getting sober is asking yourself, why do you want this? Why do you want to change? Right? Like, there has to be a driving motivation. And then telling them to also make the connection to keeping some kind of record or keeping some kind of journal, just so that you can refer back to it and have a data point to help inform you moving forward.
I think that's great. You know, it relates back to what we were talking about earlier, which is just, you know, we have to be honest with ourselves, and that allows us to be honest with ourselves. It
Right.
allows like a conscious effort to say, okay, here's what's going on, because it's so easy to live unconsciously, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's so easy to just go, and all of a sudden, you know, a year or 2 years or 5 years has gone by, and you're like, what the hell just happened?
Right.
And it's so important. I love the whole data point, you know, thing. I've done a lot of that sort of work in my life, you know, with professionally with data and different things like that. So that's I could relate to that and thinking that way.
Yeah. And I think so many of us, like, use alcohol or substances as a means to cope. And if you the thing about it is, the brain is so intelligent, like, it's going to try to delude us into thinking, like, maybe once you remove the substance, when you're having that craving or that trigger, your brain is going to try and tell you, like, oh, it's fine, because why wouldn't it be fine? Or you can just do this. You can, like, it will find a way to basically present a case on behalf of alcohol, because you're having literally a biological like,
So true.
craving for it. So it's like, if you have something else that can counter that, like, and remind yourself, like, like, actually, um and that can also go, that's one way, like, looking at all the maybe like negative ways alcohol could be impacting you, or the cravings you're having. But even on a positive note, like, documenting all of the ways in which you may feel differently, um, can be, I think, really helpful, because we want to celebrate success. We want to celebrate progress. We want to be able to see how our bodies, our mental state, our physical, like, just everything is changing, from no longer ingesting a toxic substance, whatever that substance may look like. And it's not going to be an overnight thing. I want to be clear, because as someone who is who especially was back then quite vain, I thought I was going to, turn into like the next supermodel because I quit drinking, and like that didn't happen. Realistically, that did not happen. Now I have, more time. I definitely see that my skin is cleared up and other things have happened, but like sometimes this is a common thread for many people, especially if you quit drinking alcohol, the sugar content, like you have so many cravings that sometimes can be
Mm.
replaced. So it's like you have to see that it's a lesser evil and just give yourself grace is the point I'm trying to make. Like give yourself some time and keep track of like how you actually feel. And then, if you gain more perspective down the line when you have more time, sober time, it's quite comical. Like I always like to see lightness and humor in my sobriety because life is serious, but is it that serious? Like my sobriety is very serious, but life in itself, it can be funny. So like looking back sometimes and being like, oh my gosh, like the drama. It's like reading your like imagine finding your diary from like being 13 or 12. You're like, was it that serious? Because I have notes on my phone and I read them back from like those early wee hours of sobriety, and I'm like, you would have thought that my life was ending. Like you would have thought that the world was literally like the second coming. I don't know. But it was yeah, it was difficult, but now I see like most things in life, it's worth it. Like it has to be a little hard for it to be worth it, and it definitely was worth it for me.
That's great. No, I'm so happy. I'm so happy that you're coming up on 3 years. I guess today is 2 months from 3 years, which
Oh my gosh, is
is
it the fifth?
really,
Oh my
really cool.
gosh,
Yeah.
that's crazy.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, it is. It is.
Yeah.
And I think anytime you experience a craving, I don't get so much cravings now, but I think I'm just going back in my early sober brain. It's really helpful. I read something, I don't remember where, so I can't give credit to the source, but it said something like humans experience an emotion for literally less than 30 seconds. So we try and quell, or we try to like anytime an unpleasant feeling comes up, like you feel it viscerally in your body, right? Like when you're having anxiety, when you're feeling like pangs of depression, but the actual lasting like feeling is less than 30 seconds. And so we try
Mm.
and immediately numb out or find a way to like get rid of that discomfort. But if you actually look at like the timeline, it's not that long. So I would say tell people to like counter that by doing something. And especially if it's a craving or something like that, I think if you're able to, literally like do a push up, do a jumping jacks, do something that immediately will just get you out of that headspace where you're like now obsessing about the fact that you have an unpleasant feeling, and immediately your coping mechanism is no longer available, aka alcohol. So what are you going to do? Obsess about it now for the next hour. And no, and just do something else to try and counter that. That's just something that I heard that was actually really helpful because I'm very physical, and I'm like, that really helped me. Or journal, write it, get your feelings out.
I did a lot of that early on. I would just write. I'd have either a legal pad or whatever, and I would just write, and I would just spill everything out onto the legal pad, and that did wonders for me,
Right.
for many, many, many things. And if I were to go back and read those things now, I'd be like, oh my Lord, it really wasn't that bad, was it, Daryl? So anyway, we're running up on it, but I so much appreciate you, and so much appreciate your story. And I know that, this discussion will help people, and, younger people. So many are mired in, alcohol and drugs, and they're not enjoying it. And it is an issue. So anything we can do to help. But so how do we find you and the Sober Butterfly? And if you could, let everybody know, that would be great.
I just want to say thank you so much for having me, Daryl. This has been an amazing, very cathartic experience for me to share and reminisce back to like earlier days before sobriety and getting sober, and just
Mm,
like how life looks very differently for me now. So thank you for giving me the opportunity just to like go through that timeline. And I love the work that
of
you're
course.
doing. Your book is phenomenal. And just like you
Thank
having
you.
this podcast now, feel free to have me come back on. I happily will talk more in detail about my story because I glossed over many things. But where can people find me? So you guys can find me anywhere you type in the Sober Butterfly. I'm mainly on Instagram. I also do have a website, and my podcast is available now streaming on Apple and Spotify and pretty much anywhere that you listen to podcasts. I also have a YouTube channel that I'm pretty passionate about. It's a work in progress. I say passionate, but also like under construction. I do a lot of traveling, and so traveling is like probably one of the things I'm most passionate about outside of sobriety, and now I get to combine the two. I traveled a lot even before getting sober, but the difference is it was super dangerous, and yeah, I put myself in a lot of sticky situations, whereas now I can fully enjoy the beauty of my traveling experiences. So I like to highlight sober travel as well. So yeah, find me at thesoberbutterfly.com or at the period, don't forget the period, Sober Butterfly on Instagram and TikTok and all the things.
Very cool. Thank you so much, Nadine. Just wonderful to have you on and wonderful to chat. And we will definitely do this again as I get my legs under me in terms of my podcasting here. But great experience. So thank you again.
Thank you. This was a wonderful interview. Thank you, Daryl, for having me.
Thank you, Nadine.